Welcome. Thank you for lending an ear to the Voice of the Times for Wednesday, April 28, 2021. For today's editorial, U.S. questioning of Philippine agriculture import permits is out of line. As if the Duterte administration didn't already have enough to worry about with domestic actors trying to scuttle its recent efforts to manage agricultural imports to ensure food security, the U.S. government has raised an entirely new issue with a complaint about the way the Philippines manages sanitary and phytosanitary import clearances, or SPS-IC. An SPS-IC is a clearance issued by the Department of Agriculture or DA through the Bureau of Animal Industry or BAI or Bureau of Plant Industry or BPI for imports to certify that they are free from pests or diseases that could harm the country's agriculture sector or pose a risk to the public health. The U.S. government, however, believes that the Philippines uses SPS-ICs in a manner it deems inappropriate, as a kind of non-tariff tool to restrict imports for the sake of protecting domestic production. These accusations emerged in a communication the U.S. government made to the World Trade Organization or WTO Committee on Import Licensing meeting last week. Quote, "The United States is concerned that the Philippines uses the SPS-ICs to restrict imports for reasons that appear unrelated to the protection of human, animal, or plant life or health." The U.S. note to the committee meeting was quoted as saying. The note went on to explain that, quote, "We are specifically concerned by the repeated public statements by the Philippines Department of Agriculture that it is using the SPS-IC system to periodically block imports of rice, corn, and feed wheat during its domestic harvest seasons." The U.S. also said that it had received, presumably from annoyed American exporters, quote, "reports of ongoing SPS-IC rejections without reason since September 2020 for the importation of U.S. whole chickens." Here's a question we would like our responsible officials in the DA and the Department of Trade and Industry or DTI to ask the U.S. representatives. So what? Under WTO rules, almost every tradable commodity has what is called a minimum access volume or MAV, the minimum amount that a country must allow to be imported. There are a vast number of complex conditions attached to this, depending on the commodity being traded, including tariff rates, the type of permits required, and so on. But the bottom line is, as long as the country meets the stipulated MAV in a given year, how it gets to that figure is its own business. The subtext of the U.S. concern is that it is the American position that its agricultural exports must be allowed into the Philippines whenever an SPS-IC is requested. This is an arrogant and meddlesome point of view, and certainly not one that the U.S. government, which has been very slow to take action to unwind the protectionist trade measures imposed by the former Trump administration, would reciprocate for the sake of Philippine exports to its country. The U.S. government should be reminded that agricultural imports are based on our country's needs, not theirs. Some imports are necessary to ensure food security or to meet demand for commodities that are not domestically available, but otherwise, policies that favor our own agricultural sector must be prioritized. We see nothing wrong with our government's managing of SPS-ICs. WTO rules in general favor big exporters like the US at the expense of smaller, less capable countries like the Philippines. So in that sense, our authorities should be credited with finding creative ways to minimize unfair competition for our own agricultural sector. So long as the actions taken by our government are in accordance with the WTO provisions and the fact that the US resorted to attempting to pressure the Philippines through an informal note to a WTO committee rather than lodging a formal complaint tends to confirm they should continue. As good a friend as the U.S. is to the Philippines, it should be reminded to mind its own business when it comes to agricultural trade and not to make any further attempts to bend rules that already give it an undue advantage in order to put pressure on this country. And that's the editorial for April 28, 2021. For more news and information, get a copy of the Manila Times on print. Subscribe to its digital edition or log on to www.manilatimes.net. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, and listen to the Voice of the Times.